As an elderly woman in 1834, she didn't really have much of a choice. It was either she die here or she would have to go to the attic. And anyone who goes to the attic, they don't ever come back. She knew that her life was almost over, but suffering would be worse than death. She was already chained to the stove and she was terrified of this attic. She had heard the horrors, the sounds of crying, the lashes of whips, and she just knew that she wanted to expose the torture that was happening here in this mansion. The torture was all she had ever known. She needed to start this fire, even if it meant dying in the process. Death had never terrified her, but the attic did. The suffering did. Everyone here knew suffering was a harsher punishment than burning alive. At least the fire would end. When the flame started, maybe she was scared, or maybe this was something that she could withstand. Maybe the flames were any worse than wearing the iron collar that made her neck sit a little too awkward, or being starved, or beaten, or mutilated, or never even being seen as a person with a soul. As the fire crackled, so did the walls. With them revealed the dark, ugly truth. Everyone in the home would be able to get out of the house, except for the enslaved people. Some were still chained up in the attic, and some were dying from the fire, and some had already died from the torture because of the devil herself, Delphine. By the time help arrived, they were able to save a few of the enslaved, but Delphine was pissed. She kept telling them, "You shouldn't have come here." When the judge showed up with a few rescuers, they would find that elderly woman still chained to the stove. She was terrified. When they asked her why she started it, she said she had no choice. She didn't want to go to the attic. Clearly, this had piqued their interests, so the old woman would lead them up to the attic and they were stunned. Enslaved people were chained up, tortured, suspended by their necks, wearing iron collars. Men, women, and even children and the elderly, their limbs were torn, their faces were disfigured. Some were so unrecognizable, they were bleeding and their wounds were infected. The smell alone would have been enough to have anyone turn away. These were Delphine's enslaved people, and this fire would reveal what Delphine LaLaurie had been doing and how this charming socialite of a woman became the most vile and wicked woman, and how she was the devil of New Orleans. And the people were not about to let her get away with this. Welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen. With me is Kira. In this podcast, we talk about all sorts of things, whether it's true crime, mysteries, cults, or anything that we find interesting. Today, we are going to be discussing a lot of themes surrounding slavery, torture, and murder, and enslaved people, specifically around the time period of the late 1700s and the 1800s. So if any of that is maybe too close to home for you, or maybe you're just not in the headspace for it, feel free to check out another episode or take care of yourself, and we'll see you in a different one. I don't want to sugarcoat this episode. I am going to be honest, this is going to be a pretty serious episode, but this is such an old case, so there are some things that haven't been proven because obviously when cases become so gruesome, people just like to almost make them entertainment and make them way worse than what they are. So there might be some things that I'm unsure if it really happened, but I did my hardest to fact check and go through multiple sources with this case. If I say anything wrong, or if you have any other information, or you just want to join in the conversation, feel free to in the comments down below. So, Delphine McCarty was only 4 years old when the Haitian Revolution began to prosper in 1791. This revolution became one of the very first successful slave revolts in Haiti, which at the time was part of the French colony Saint Dominique. This resulted in one of the very first states founded by former enslaved people, and this really gave a lot of enslaved people a beacon of hope. And obviously, a bunch of enslaved holders were pissed about this, and they were actually very afraid of their enslaved people trying to fight back. Delphine's own uncle had been killed by his own enslaved people back in 1771. The enslaved holders, especially in the southern United States and the Caribbean, decided that they were going to try to stop this by instilling fear into the enslaved people. So they were amping up the abuse and the torture. In the 19th century, it was estimated that there was over 40,000 enslaved people in Louisiana. So the slave trade was very active in New Orleans, and if you had an enslaved person, it just meant that you had a high social status and you were rich. If you saw someone who had to take care of their own chores, their own house, do their own work, they were just seen as poor. And so if you saw somebody who had multiple enslaved people, that meant they were really rich. And Delphine grew up with this lifestyle of just being extremely wealthy. Her parents were prominent figures in the European Creole community. Her uncle was the governor of the Spanish American provinces, which was Louisiana and Florida. Her cousin was the mayor of New Orleans. So she just was already like born into this family that just had a lot of privilege. Her mom was known to throw these like wild, extravagant parties. So Delphine would end up having three husbands. She would marry her very first husband, which was Raymond de Lopez, in 1800. She was the very, very old age of 13 years old, and her husband was 35. Totally normal age gap, but of course, this was very normal at the time. He was second in command to her uncle, and he actually had been previously married. During Raymond's first marriage, he lost his wife while he was on a voyage from Spain to Louisiana. I'm not entirely sure if she drowned or if she got sick while they were traveling or if the boat kind of like capsized. But since she died, he grew really bitter of the Spanish crown. And he started to become a little bit rebellious and he started to piss off Spain. He would defy Spain's orders. He was just kind of fucking around, honestly. And because of this, he was being shuffled around the globe and had no real direct position. This marriage didn't even last that long. By the time Delphine was pregnant, he died while he had been pardoned and was boarding a ship in Havana, and the boat sank. So within 5 years, Raymond had made Delphine a mother and a widow, and she was just around like 18 or 19 years old. When Delphine's mother had passed away in 1808, she would divide her estate among her three children, and Delphine's inheritance was around $33,000, which now would be roughly around a million USD. So, like most women, Delphine needed to get remarried because, she had a kid and she needed a husband. And so, just like a few weeks after her mom had died, she would get married at the age of 21 to a man named Jean Bloch, who was a businessman. He was a banker, a merchant, a lawyer. He was like kind of everything. It seemed like it was more of a business opportunity for these two to get married because her mom had left her a plantation and he also had a plantation. So it seemed like they kind of got married for a business reasoning and not because they loved each other at all. So Delphine's mom left her a plantation on the bank of the Mississippi River, 52 enslaved people, livestock, and farm equipment. On top of this, her father also gifted them when they got married another plantation property on the Charter Street, another 26 enslaved people. So in total, her net worth was around $2 million. Her husband would go on to purchase a two-story townhouse next to the Bank of Louisiana where he worked at, and Jean and Delphine would go on to have five children by 1815, and she still had her oldest from her first marriage. So Delphine's husband was a lot older than her. He was 52 when she was 28, and he would die. She was left to settle the estate he owned, but since she had a lot of privilege in her life, she was able to sell off a lot of her assets from the home, and she was also able to sell a few enslaved people to pay off any debt. This was a very common thing during this time period where you could just sell human beings because they were considered property. They were considered an asset, which is generally disturbing. So Delphine would go on to actually purchase one of his properties, and then she kept a few of her enslaved people. So Delphine had owned roughly around 8 enslaved people that had died within only a few years apart, and nobody really knows exactly why because it wasn't entirely documented. There was a woman, her name was Bonnie. She was a cook and a laundress. She had her 4 children, Juliet, Florence, Jewel, and Leontine, and Bonnie was known to be a runaway enslaved person, but a lot of reports of what really happened is kind of washed away and no one knows what happened, which is really rare because, like I said, enslaved people were seen as an asset, so it wasn't just like if someone had a runaway enslaved person, that wasn't normal. They would wanna know where they went because that was money to them. So by 1824, Delphine's father would also die, although he didn't really leave her a lot. He left her around $5,000, which was around 166,000 now. And he also left her two enslaved people and a free woman of color, which I don't understand how you can leave someone who's free, but also leave them in your possession. That's a little confusing.
Yeah, it's also just weird to be like, "Yeah, this is my human," you know?
Yeah, like, just I can't whenever I think about this time period, I generally cannot imagine just, like, waking up and, like, having someone you just see them as nothing. It's generally so disturbing.
It is because it's like, man, really, like, how dumb were people? Because, I mean, they have thoughts and feelings too, but they were just like, no, they're beneath me."
Yeah, I know, that's the craziest thing too. I, like, look back at it and I'm just like I literally can't even come up with a thought because it's like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's just so fucking weird that people looked at somebody and was like, "Yep, I'll buy that person, and they'll live in a shack outside my house, and that'll be it." So crazy. Yeah. After Delphine's father had died and, she's also a widow, she was doing really well, though, despite being 38, having two dead husbands and five children. She had a lot of money and she had a home. She had enslaved people to take care of her housework and her labor. She was living her life like any high ranking socialite would. She probably was just drinking tea and like throwing massive parties, I guess. She would change things up a little though when her daughter was needing some help with her back, and she brought her to a chiropractor where she would meet this young doctor from France. His name was Louis LaLaurie. He was 15 years younger than her, so he was around like 23, 24, and she was 38, which is definitely an age gap, but very rare at this time for a woman to marry a man that's so much younger than her. But these two got really, really close and she became pregnant, which was, a big no no. You couldn't get pregnant out of wedlock. And so they would actually go and get married after their son was born. And then they backdated their wedding so it looked like they were married before their son was born.
Ooh, the tea.
Yeah, I know, like, this was the crazy tea back in this day. You could own an entire person, but God forbid you have sex before you've been married. Her net worth at this time was around 3,000,000 in today's currency. So she was just living this high life. They would end up in 1831 buying this mansion at 1140 Royal Street that she managed with her own name, with her husband pretty much having no involvement, which was very rare at the time. So this mansion was 2 stories high. It was complete with an attached enslaved quarter, and she lived there with her two daughters and her husband. And she just kind of threw massive parties doing whatever rich women did. Her marriage was really intense. They would fight a lot. Delphine was known to be mentally unwell. She was known to have a lot of mood swings and fits of rage, and people generally found her a little bit, like you just don't want to get on her bad side. And her husband, Louis, had actually said he regretted marrying such a rich, eccentric woman because they would kind of break up and then get back together. It was just very intense. They actually tried to get a divorce. She tried to claim he was abusing her, although I feel like it was the other way around, but they ended up never getting like an actual proper divorce. So I don't know if they were just constantly like, I'm breaking up with you, and then no, I'm not. I don't really know what was going on there. They were very all over the place. So Delphine was seen as this very charming and fun woman. She was hosting these really wild dinner parties. She was known to have expensive furniture, expensive wine and food. And, like she probably was getting a lot of furniture that was like imported from Italy or something. And she was just kind of living this lavish lifestyle. And she had a lot of enslaved people, which obviously showed her high social status and her wealth. She wasn't like the other girls, and legitimately, she was actually seen as a person. Usually, women at this time, even if you were born into a rich family, and let's say you married a man who was very poor, your husband or any other male family figures would be the one seen as the one with the money and not you. And obviously, a lot of women were only seen as assets to their husbands or, making children, and pretty much that was all you were. But for Delphine, she was able to purchase things and take care of her home and kind of run things just as herself. And so a lot of women started to get really jealous and they were kind of resentful of Delphine. They just started to gossip a lot. But the gossip started to say that she was very cruel to her enslaved people. But how was that any different than any other slaveholder? Delphine was like any other vile and wicked person. She was loved, and she was just seen as this graceful, loving woman. She was seen as this caring person. She was known to be very kind to people of color because, that totally means you're not a bad person. Even though she would still make sure they knew that they were beneath her, she was still seen to have such grace. She had a reputation because she had freed her own enslaved people, which was very rare at the time. So, for a lot of people, they were like, oh, she's just this amazing person. But there was a lot of reports from guests after leaving a lot of her parties that she was very vindictive and cruel to her enslaved people. They started to notice that a lot of her enslaved people were really hungry and starving and exhausted and overworked. But I mean, I feel like most enslaved holders were doing that to their people, but there was still, a lot of these people that owned enslaved people usually were wanting them to be, I guess, like have like the basics so that they were able to work because they wanted them to obviously do their crops and shit just so they could make money off these poor people. People started to get really suspicious though because her daughters were also seen to be very depressed and people started to be like, "Oh, she's hot and then she's cold." And I think people were kind of concerned. So, one of the guests had actually left her party and they decided that they were going to go and talk to a lawyer to check in on the well-being of her enslaved people because at the time there was regulations for enslaved people, and I'm saying regulations very, very loose. This was called the French Code Noir or the Code Black. Basically, the code was to have enslaved people treated with very, very, very little minimal respect. And I'm saying that like they weren't even treated with respect because I mean obviously they were an enslaved person, so they weren't treated with anything, but they had rules such as they had to be fed, they had to have clothes and shelter, and they couldn't work on Sundays because obviously Sundays for the Lord and you couldn't have them work on those days. They couldn't work on holidays, although sometimes they could and they could actually make money. They also had requirements for enslaved people to be free. So, for example, an enslaved person would be able to be free if they saved money or if they paid for their freedom or they showed a lot of respect to their slaveholder. But of course, let's not be stupid and let's use our critical thinking skills. This was always going to be in the favor of the enslaved holder and never for the enslaved person. Basically, what could happen is if another person saw somebody treating their enslaved person very bad, which feels like an oxymoron, honestly, they could report them to a council member or a lawyer and they could be held liable and be prosecuted for it. But obviously, it was really up to the lawyer to even go through with it because obviously, if someone was really rich or it was a family member, like they weren't going to go check on them because they were like, oh, I don't care. And that's actually what had happened with Delphine. Someone reported her, and the lawyer never checked in because he felt like there was really no reason to do it because Delphine was so wonderful, I guess.
How was she wonderful? I mean, she was rich.
I think that's what it was, honestly. I think that a lot of the people just turned their blind eye to all of her shit because she was rich and they probably knew, like, money she can buy you something or she can buy you a reputation. And they probably were just like, "Oh, I don't care. Like, I don't want to stir the pot." So apparently, though, there had been people who had seen some things. Apparently, there was an incident where there was this 12-year-old enslaved girl who had fallen off the building. And a lot of people started to share rumors. Some suggested that this young girl took her life after she was brushing Delphine's hair and she brushed her hair a little too hard. And in order to escape the punishment, she jumped off the building. But from witnesses, they said that they saw her chase this girl with a whip off the building until she fell. And then Delphine took this girl and she put her young little body into a well and just stuffed her there until the police actually did find this girl, and they actually did prosecute Delphine in a way. They basically forced her to sell her enslaved people, but the way she went about this is she sold them to her friends and family and then just brought them back to her place. Like, she never got held liable. It wasn't like she served any time or anything. It was just like, yeah, don't do that. Delphine was very deplorable and evil. She would whip her enslaved people, she would beat them until they were unconscious, chain them up, and just torture them severely. She had some that she would just have as her own servants, and then she would have others that she would take to the attic where she would torture them. So Delphine was a lot older than her husband, like I said, and she would actually keep some of her enslaved people kind of barricaded away from the outside world so people couldn't see. Now, in a lot of sources, they were trying to say like the husband had no idea. I feel like that's giving him too much grace. I feel like he knew what was going on and just didn't give a shit. Because there's no way you don't know that someone's being tortured in your own home. There's just no way. Apparently, her daughters were also really depressed and they were beaten if they tried to feed the enslaved people or if they even showed sympathy for them. And so none of the torture would actually be exposed until one of Delphine's enslaved people was really afraid of the punishment and decided that they were going to start a fire to possibly die. So on April 10th, 1834, the fire started in the mansion because there was this elderly woman who was chained to the stove. I wasn't able to find any information on this woman. I don't know what her name was because obviously Delphine most likely didn't give a shit. And in order for this woman to get the truth out there, she started the fire. Now, I don't actually know if that was really her goal was to expose Delphine or if it really was to just end her life because she probably knew she wanted to get away from the punishment and the torture. She had heard the cries and the abuse going on in the attic, and everyone knew you just don't come back from the attic. I feel like in a movie sense, it would be like, oh, this woman is gonna start a fire to expose her. But I feel like in a real event, I feel like it was probably more plausible that she just wanted to end her life to get away from that horrible torture, if that kind of makes sense. So once the fire broke out, there were guests that were in the mansion and they were all able to get out of the house except for the enslaved people. And they weren't trying to rescue any of them. So the judge and a few of the firefighters were able to get onto the scene and save some of the enslaved people. And they noticed that Delphine was a lot more preoccupied with her furniture than her enslaved people. The judge was really confused and she started to beef with him. She was telling him that he shouldn't have ever came here. And so the judge would go inside the mansion and they would actually find that elderly woman and they were able to rescue her. And when they asked her why she started the fire, she would go on to explain that she was afraid of the attic. And that's when she would lead the judge and a few rescuers up to the attic. So only around 7 enslaved people were rescued, but what they saw was so deplorable that the judge was extremely shocked, and even the newspaper wouldn't report fully on what they had seen. Now, I don't know if the newspaper didn't want to write about it or if it really was just disturbing because I don't know why they wouldn't tell them everything. But when the judge walked inside the attic, What he saw was enslaved people that were abused and tortured, ages ranging from children to elderly people. They were mutilated. Some were suspended in the air by their necks. Their arms and legs were stretched and torn from their sockets. They were wearing these iron collars. They were like spiked so they couldn't move their head a certain way. They were chained up. Their faces were extremely disfigured. They were unable to walk due to the level of torture. Some of them couldn't even hold themselves because they were starving and their wounds were infected. They were just covered in bruises. There was an elderly man who was so tortured, he was disfigured that they couldn't really recognize who he was. There was a woman where you could see the bones on her back that were exposed. They allegedly had also found bottles of blood stored away, which I have no idea if that is fabricated or why she would have that.
And this was her doing this, right?
Yeah, just her. There were like reports that she was more harshly abusive to the male enslaved people, but I don't know if that's entirely true because there was a lot of like some things that were fabricated saying that she also was a cannibal. I think that was just people kind of dramatizing it, but it seemed that she was just sadistic and she was just torturing people for fun. The judge would go on and question Delphine's husband, and he literally said, some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses and dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. He literally was just like to the judge, mind your own business, which is why I believe this man knew what was going on because I feel like if you didn't know and then you saw that, you'd be like, I had no idea that was going on because I feel like any person with a conscience would be like, what the fuck? But I mean, how evil do you have to be for other evil people to also think you're evil? That's crazy. When the news came out, people literally flooded her mansion and they began to destroy what was left. They found furniture and they carted it up to the roof and threw it off. They started to circle the mansion with axes and they were just destroying. And when Delphine was able to get out of the house, she was getting ready on a horse and carriage and trying to get away. And the people were trying to attack the carriage, but Delphine was literally able to get away. So a lot of the enslaved people were brought to the police station and they were kind of put on display for people to see what had happened to them, which that just bothers me so much because I just can't imagine going through all of that and then kind of being seen and put on display for everyone to look at you.
Yeah, like putting them up to be window shopped and gawked at.
Yeah, I have no words, literally no words. The police would actually go and dig up and find a lot of bodies on her lot. Now, some sources said that they found roughly around 74 bodies, but a lot of them don't know if this was a rumor or if this was true. But I wouldn't put it past her to have killed a lot of her own and just bury them. So Delphine and her husband would flee and catch a boat and run away to France. So charges were never actually filed against her or her husband, but her reputation was extremely destroyed. They were pretty much exiled out of Louisiana, but I mean, that's still not enough of a punishment. Her reputation was very destroyed, which I mean, again, isn't enough, but there really isn't a whole lot of like what's documented of what happened to Delphine. She was in Paris, where that was where her husband was from, and she didn't leave any orders for her enslaved people to be free or to be placed elsewhere. And one thing I found really interesting is she actually didn't show any signs of distress of what happened, but apparently when she was on the boat, she was moved to tears because the people were treating her like shit and she just couldn't imagine that they were treating her like shit. Like she was crying over being treated like shit, but not over what she had done. So once her and her husband and her son moved to France, they awaited for some more of their family. A few years later, her husband traveled to Cuba and he never really returned and he allegedly died in Havana in the 1860s. So it's alleged that Delphine wanted to go back to Louisiana based on her son's journal entries or letters that he had sent out. She really wanted to go back, but no one knows where she actually died, if it was in Paris. And a lot of people theorize that her son either brought her back after she died, or she died there without anyone knowing, or that they just have like a tombstone there. I have no idea. There's really no documents of what actually happened to Delphine. But with this type of crime, of course, people gossip, and there were just rumors that turned this violent crime and abuse into entertainment, into ghost stories. People would spread lies and exaggerate the truth of what she had done, when in reality, to me, what she did does not need to be exaggerated. She was just evil and vile. You don't need to make her crime any more awful to make it any worse. I think it's really important that when we look at cases like these, we don't look at them as entertainment, and that we don't just try to take something that's already awful and exaggerate it, because it doesn't need that. What Delphine did, though, it's not isolated. This was very common for enslaved people to be abused, tortured, murdered. Women and children, and even men, were raped by their enslaved holders. And although what Delphine did was disgusting, this isn't just a one-time story. This has happened for centuries and is still happening. And people didn't care at that time, and it has tainted America and all over the world. And we should not forget what happened, and it should make you uncomfortable. I think what made people more uncomfortable was the fact that Delphine was a woman, and not to make this like a man versus woman thing, but I think that, people are used to men doing this stuff. And so I think the idea that Delphine was the one who did it, and she was this woman and she had a high social status, is probably what made people turn this case and exaggerate it. There was just a lot of exaggerations. Like, apparently they claimed that she was killed by wild boars. I feel like that's just trying to take this story and make it more wild. And I think the idea of dramatizing it and making it into this awful story makes people more interested in reading it, and not looking at the fact that these are real people that existed. Unfortunately, though, I tried to look in what happened to a lot of her enslaved people, but there really wasn't a lot of information. It seems that they were able to sell 11 out of 30, and over 19 were undocumented. So it seems like they were either sold off to other people, or they died from the aftermath of the fire, or from their other wounds that they had went through. But it generally disturbs me to think that Delphine was, in a way, able to get away with this. Like, she was able to fuck off to France, and these enslaved people were just sold off, and that's their story. You can still go to the mansion today. Like, I believe they have tours, and people claim that you can still hear the cries and the whips of the enslaved people, and that their ghosts are still haunting. But I honestly think that's kind of disgusting to turn this into a ghost story. But also, hypothetically, if there is ghosts, I would really hope that the enslaved people have been able to rest and have peace, and not still live through that. Like, I just don't like hearing when people are like, oh, I can still hear the cries. I just think we're turning this case into something that's more of a ghost story and entertainment, and not sit down and remember, like, these were human fucking beings that existed and were just sold off. There was how many other people that were just assaulted and murdered, all for what? But that's pretty much what we have for this episode. I'm curious to know what everyone's thoughts are on this. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I meant no harm to anyone who has been affected by this case, or anyone who has been affected by racism, or who has experienced racism. And I hope I explained this with as much factual information and empathy as I could. And we will see you guys next week.